Hello and welcome to this conversation with Shiv Shankar Menon to mark the launch of the latest Lowy Institute paper, India in a World Adrift. I'm Sam Roggeveen, Director of the Lowy Institute's International Security Program and editor of the Lowy Institute Papers series. The Lowy Institute papers are our flagship publication. They are peer-reviewed long essays written by experts on the key international issues of our time. We're proud to publish these papers in association with Penguin Random House Australia. The paper retails for $12.99, and here in Australia, it's available at all good bookstores, as well as online. For those joining from outside Australia, we recommend purchasing via penguin.com.au. And now to our guest. Shiv Shankar Menon has held many of the most important positions in Indian foreign policy. He served as National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, as India's Foreign Secretary, as Ambassador to China and Israel, and as High Commissioner to Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Since leaving government, he's held affiliations with the Brookings Institution, Harvard Kennedy School, the National University of Singapore, and Ashoka University. Shankar has written widely on Indian foreign policy, publishing 2 books, now a third, and regular articles in Foreign Affairs magazine. In 2023, Shiv Shankar Menon was the Rothschild & Co. Distinguished International Fellow at the Lowy Institute. Shiv Shankar Menon, welcome back to the Lowy Institute and congratulations on the publication of this fine paper.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed my association with Lowy.
Oh, that's wonderful. I wanted to ask you, I know that you finished writing this book after Donald Trump won the 2024 presidential election, and the book does an excellent job of thinking through the implications of the presidency, which was still in the future at that point. But like most of us, you've surely been shocked by the pace and the scale of change since President Trump took the oath of office in January. What has surprised you the most?
That's an interesting question. I think 2 things have really surprised me since January. One, of course, is how organized, radicalized, and effective in pursuit of its goals Trump 2.0 is. And I say Trump 2.0 advisedly because it's not just about President Trump himself. Unlike Trump 1.0, when it was mainly about him, and it took a while for the administration to come together to get people, they kept changing personnel. But this time it's actually a broad, some would say motley, coalition that has come to power, which includes MAGA faithful, populists, billionaires, techno-anarchists, others from business. I mean, it's a huge coalition, but they've come organized and radicalized. I made the mistake, I confess, of thinking earlier that U.S. foreign policy might not change too much if President Trump came back to power. But that internally it would. That I think I've been. But certainly this coalition is now creating an alternate reality for its believers of a failing U.S. economy, of a West Asia waiting for redemption at U.S. hands, et cetera, of a Europe which is a hanger-on, which is, freeloading, and so on. So, I mean, that level of organization and determination to go after its goals, that has impressed me, has surprised me. I'm also surprised in some ways by the reluctance of the old American establishment to recognize what seems to me to be both a structural and an existential adjustment in U.S. politics. Adam Tooze at one stage called Bidenomics MAGA for thinking people. In an attempt to create a socio-economic basis for a comprehensive reassertion of U.S. global leadership. And by the end of 2024, by November 2024, this involved U.S. engagement in Ukraine, Israel's aggression in West Asia, and the containment of China in East Asia. Now, on all these, Trump 2.0 has not either taken it to a whole new level or changed the terms of engagement. So I think I was wrong in my expectation that significant changes in US foreign policy could have been avoided. Glad to think I'm in good company. There was many other people who were surprised.
Yes, absolutely. But this is very, very interesting point about the lack of resistance so far from what the Obama administration used to call the blob, that is to say, the traditional foreign policy establishment in Washington. You mentioned Adam Tooze, and I notice just recently he wrote a column, maybe you're referencing the same column, in which he basically said that support for that traditional liberal internationalism in the United States has collapsed. Would you agree with that? I mean, I would personally say, yes, it's certainly receded, but does the lack of resistance, the lack of fight back from that establishment indicate its collapse?
I think because they are telling themselves this is just another turn in the wheel, and it's a question of 2 years until the next midterm, maximum 4 years until the next president. So they're treating it as just another transition, not as a fundamental historic shift. But for me, this is a historic shift. And like all historic shifts, it's the culmination of several trends and factors in the US and abroad. A US drift to protectionism, isolationism, certain amount of xenophobia, which some followers it actually drifts into racism almost. And these are all things that we've seen growing in the US for a while. So yes, I think it's the end of the old liberal consensus. But I don't think the establishment has quite got its head around the idea that this is a big shift. Trump got a majority, and that means something. And he now has control of the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and so on. So there is a larger enabling historical process at work here, which has enabled Trump 2.0 to be effective and so radical. That doesn't mean that he hasn't changed policies. Of course, he's changed policies and tactics on several things. But if you look at it, Trump's Middle East policy is not very different from Biden's, letting Netanyahu do what he wants, but without even the pretense of even-handedness, even embracing ethnic cleansing. Nor is there any attempt now to disguise disdain for the global South. On China, so far, it's more of the same, though he may well seek a grand bargain. And, Elridge Colby, the new Undersecretary for Policy at the Pentagon, has said that the defense of Taiwan is not worth the cost. So, trade policy, he's done what he promised, which actually is to take the next steps in Biden's continuation of Trump 1.0. So, where there are changes, I'm not denying that there are big changes: climate, energy policy, internal U.S. administration, governance, multilateral institutions. Well, nobody revived WTO under the Biden administration. But he has rewritten relations with the allies, with NATO, with Ukraine, with Canada, with Mexico, on trade and the economy. So yes, I do think that the old consensus certainly, I think, is dead in the US. That doesn't mean there aren't adherents and those who wouldn't wish for its return. But I think that's also a bit dangerous. History doesn't go backward and doesn't repeat itself. So for me, yes, I would fundamentally agree with your statement, but maybe not for the rest of the world. The rest of the world still, there are believers.
Yeah, so yes, that's true. And I was just thinking about your statement at the beginning that this is clearly a big shift, and obviously it is. What I'm struggling with, I must say, in my own analysis is a big shift to what exactly? It's very easy to see what they're breaking. It's not very easy to discern what they're building, if anything. So is there a grand theory that could explain all this? Do you have one?
I don't have one. I know I use the word to describe today's situation. I normally say it's between orders. That assumes there's a new order coming. I am now tending to think that it should be described as an orderless world rather than. And come to think of it, Uh, if you think of history, for most of history, we haven't had a world order. It's only after even the first half of the 21st century, which really is what this seems to resemble most today's situation. It's only after World War II that you have one homogeneous world order where Westphalian states have spread across the whole world, where, and it takes a huge preponderance of power in the hands of either one power, and then the Mongols or the US after World War II, or a group of powers, the Europeans, West Europeans after, in the late 19th, early 20th century, to create a world order. And that's exceptional. For most of history, we haven't had a world order. World orders are exceptional. And we haven't done badly. And when was mankind most innovative and most creative? When did we progress the fastest? In times when there wasn't an order. Of course, the hegemon has an interest in convincing you that order is necessary, is good, it's wonderful. But I think the benefits of order have also been exaggerated to some. Look at India's experience. Cold War, yes, a bipolar order gave us opportunities to do some balancing, some hedging. But we also did very well in the unipolar moment, the globalization decades. That's when India grew fastest. Those were the high growth years. That's when, it's 2001, 2011, that we pulled 140 million people out of poverty. So for me, it's not so much whether the absence or presence of order can be good or bad. That's not. But you look at the creative times in human history, 6th century BC, the Axial Age, not the most peaceful time. China's most creative moments, Sung China, when it was partitioned into three, and Sung were really losing their battles steadily. But it's also when paper, the compass, printing, when gunpowder, all that was invented. The same with look at Europe, when the Industrial Revolution, and those centuries are exactly the same, 4 centuries of war, actually. Yeah. So I'm not sure that you can make the case that order is somehow better for human progress. That doesn't mean it makes it easier to live in. Frankly, most people would rather live ordered, settled lives. But if you look at it today, it's quite impressive. Today, more people live longer, healthier, more prosperous lives than ever before in history. And yet, the last 3 decades, 2.5 decades, we haven't had a single international agreement on a matter of consequence which is binding on all of us. We have destroyed the international institutions, reduced their effectiveness to almost zero, whether it's the UN, whether it's WTO. We responded, it was really each man for himself when we responded to the pandemic. We didn't even do what we did in response to HIV/AIDS when it came to COVID. By every measure, there's been less and less order over the last decade and a half, certainly. Last time we acted together effectively was in 2009 to prevent another Great Depression, when the G20 in London did something together. So for me, the question of order, of a liberal order, of a rule-based order, was settled some time ago. And there hasn't been a functioning liberal rule-based order for a long time. Where we're going, that's $1 million question. I wish we knew. But it doesn't worry me too much, because it seems to me that the absence of a rigid order actually provides opportunities for middle powers, like Australia, like India, for others. There's space here that has opened up. Of course, it's going to be difficult. It's not going to be easy, but.
Well, what you've done very skillfully there, Shankar, is actually describe and summarize a key theme in your book about the lack of world order. I just wondered if you could dwell on that theme a little bit longer by actually talking us through the title of the book. Why do you say the world is adrift?
Well, it's adrift because today all the great powers are basically revisionist. Nobody is happy with today's situation. Everybody wants to change it. When you say "Make America Great Again," you're not happy with what there is today. It's the same with Xi Jinping when he says, achieve the China dream. It means it's a dream. It's not there today. We're not happy with the existing order. Putin has shown by his actions what he thinks. But that's true across the board. You can go through the global south, anywhere you ask, they want change. Somebody wants, and so and nobody's stepping up to be a leader, to provide the public goods that a global order would require. We've got used to an order during the Cold War and in the unipolar moment. And they were really two different orders, but both led by the US and the West. Today, I think that era of the West as a geopolitical unit is probably over. And multilateralism as we know it is dead. I mean, we've been through this. And the result is everybody thinks they can try their luck, whether it's take Nagorno-Karabakh or whether it's, interfere in Syria, in Lebanon, Palestine, the South China Sea, Yemen, the Houthis, whatever, the Red Sea. And the ultimate example, Putin in Ukraine. Everybody thinks because there's no order, because everybody thinks they can follow their own agendas in the Himalayas, for instance. And the hegemon, the one who has the most power, is still the US, but seems to be undergoing a cultural revolution of her own. So I think that's why I think it's a world adrift, because it's each one for himself, each one following his own purposes. Some see opportunity somewhere. And China's own trajectory is also a period of major adjustment, both economic, but, that kind of adjustment, fundamental economic adjustment, also has social and political consequences. So it's going to be interesting to watch. So why do I think it'll stay adrift for a while? Because if you look at the distribution of power in the world, during Cold War, Warsaw Pact and NATO, between them, accounted for more than 80% of world GDP and more than 80% of world military power. Whereas if you look at China and US today, the two largest powers, they're still less than half of world GDP and about the same of world military power. So power is much more evenly distributed and spread around. And therefore, it's more unlikely that we'll actually end up with one world order. What we're seeing in technology is, I think, one example of that, where people are building. Look at the internet today. There are several internets in the world today. And the Chinese internet is quite separate from most other people's, at least the ordinary China, the one that the ordinary Chinese accessing, and so on. So I think there is a process of fragmentation. However, it is a globalized economy. And frankly, since 2011, the proportion of trade to world GDP, international trade to world GDP, has stayed pretty steady, above 55%, below 60%, somewhere in that range. That hasn't changed. But so if there's a flatter distribution of power, and if more people unless they can agree on what kind of world they want to make, it's going to stay a world adrift. And that's why I call it a world adrift, because I don't see where the change towards a more orderly, structured world which follows norms is coming from.
Yeah. Now, Shankar, I think I heard you say in that answer that you believe that the era of the West as a geopolitical entity is over. You would appreciate that a statement like that will hang very heavily in a country such as Australia.
Not as an entity, as a unit, as a geopolitical unit. Because I think by threatening to pull out of NATO, by what he's doing in Ukraine, by raising questions about the Article 5 commitment in NATO to the defense of Europe, and I think what we're watching, therefore, is really, we're actually watching the West now, in a sense, fragmenting. I mean, Europe seems to have one policy on Ukraine, the US seems to have another. I'm not saying the West is vanishing. In fact, the West still remains the most important component of the global system. It's just that there's no longer an orderly international, it's hard to talk of an international community or society anymore because of the reasons that I mentioned. So I want to be clear. I'm not saying the West doesn't exist. It's finished. It's gone. No. I think US authority is shrinking and has been shrinking for some time. And therefore, US's utility to its partners is also shrinking. And partners therefore look to themselves. I mean, that's clear with the way the Europeans are talking of defense and how they have to step in and help Ukraine. And there is a drift to alternatives. I mean, 41 countries want to join BRICS. I mean, this is an organization which hasn't delivered outcomes, political or economic, yet. And yet, 41 countries are willing to join it, including a whole host. If you look at the new members of BRICS, most of them are US allies or dependent on the US for security. So I'm not saying the West is finished, West doesn't exist. No, that's not all. What I'm saying is that we're in a different kind of world today. Now, of course, the primary beneficiary of this shrinking authority of the US and the drift to alternatives may well be China.
Now, Shankar, you mentioned China there, and I noticed in your book that you say in the foreseeable future, Asia won't be dominated by a single power. What makes you confident that China won't be the dominant power?
Well, I think China will be very, very important economically, and I think the Trump administration's actions have the potential of making China great again. I think that's possible. But the fact is that there are several other countries who are rising in Asia. And if you look at the distribution of power in Asia, at how different countries have developed and their traditional relationships with China, it's unlikely that we will revert to a sort of hub and spokes situation with China that we used to have with the US after the Vietnam War. What's more likely, it seems to me, is a sort of mixed bag of relationships, of certainly China as the primary economic player in Asia. But China hasn't been willing, so far at least, to provide the security and the other global public goods that people were used to expecting from the US and the West originally. So, which is why I don't think it's really going to be dominated in that sense. I mean, China still has several selfish goals for herself to achieve. I mean, the China dream, for instance, is a dream for China. And that in itself creates other kinds of friction and tension. So there will be balancing, there will be hedging, no matter how reliant the economies are. And we have to actually see the effect of these new economic arrangements that the Trump administration is putting into place. I find it very hard to predict. Frankly, it's not an area that I know very much about. But it seems to me that both China and the US are basically part of the same economic system and depend on each other like Siamese twins. And it's not as though you can separate Chinese prosperity or growth from the US economy or vice versa. So I'm a little open-minded about where this is going, but I don't see an Asia that's completely dominated by one power. No, not China, not the US, not anybody else.
Now, Shankar, we're approaching the end of our time today, but I can't leave this conversation without asking you about nuclear matters. I know you've had involvement in nuclear diplomacy in the past, including the US-India nuclear deal under the George W. Bush administration. More recently, we've heard talk from Europe in particular about Poland, about acquiring nuclear weapons. Germany seems to be receptive to the idea of a pan-European deterrent with using French and British nuclear weapons. South Korea is rapidly building its capacity to deliver nuclear weapons, even though it's stopping short of building nuclear weapons themselves. What's the future in your mind of nuclear non-proliferation? Are we on the cusp of a new round of proliferation?
Certainly, the old non-proliferation regime has unraveled already. And I think that was evident when North Korea went nuclear and basically got away with it. So today, after what's happened to Ukraine, who gave up their nuclear weapons, had guarantees in the Budapest Memorandum from everyone for their territorial integrity and so on, and was then invaded twice. So we all know what happened to them. Frankly, I think the temptation to build nuclear weapons or their own capability is going to be very high, particularly among U.S. allies who rely on extended U.S. deterrence. Why would any U.S. president risk San Francisco or New York to save Seoul or Tokyo? I mean, it's a fundamental question. And after what's happened to Ukraine, what happened to Ghani in Afghanistan, it's unlikely that people are going to trust their future. I think the most likely candidate for proliferation is really South Korea, where I believe over 76% of the population says if North Korea has nuclear weapons, we should have it too. And North Korea is not going to give up their weapons after what's happened to Ukraine, after what they saw to Gaddafi, etc. Which leaves Japan in a very strange position. I mean, I think the previous prime minister, when he was asked, shouldn't we be talking about nuclear weapons, said, now is not the time. In other words, there will be a time in the future. Poland, you just mentioned, has started a discussion on whether it needs nuclear weapons. Taiwan and Ukraine will be tempted, but I think they have their constraints. The remarkable thing is the restraint that Iran has shown so far, because they've been close to a weapon for quite some time. They have the technical capability, but I don't know whether that's going to survive this US administration's term.
I must ask you about Iranian restraint. Is that self-imposed, or do you think Iran is restrained by the deterrent power of the United States and Israel?
Well, they've certainly presented it to their people as self-imposed, as the supreme leader having issued a fatwa and saying that this is un-Islamic, this weapon. Now, he didn't just say the use of this weapon, which one could understand, or any weapon of mass destruction. He actually said the weapon itself. So it's an interesting case where they've presented it to their own people. I'm sure the external situation, does influence their decisions. But since they've tied it to their own belief system, I think it becomes a much stronger restraint, actually, than external sanctions and so on. And so it's an interesting case. So for me, the real risk is in Northeast Asia, Iran, of course. Taiwan, Ukraine, I mean, Taiwan has been stopped twice, once in the 70s, once in the 80s by the US. But if the US is saying that it's not worth the cost of defending, then I'm not sure whether they'll stop them again or not. These are question marks, but certainly the old non-proliferation regime is no longer valid, no longer working. And the interesting thing, though, is that I think most people now realize, unlike in the 60s and 70s, that nuclear weapons are not usable warfighting weapons. And that they're really there for deterrence and to defend each other. So, there were those, Kenneth Waltz, for instance, who said the more the merrier, the more people who have nuclear weapons, the more stable the international system will be, the less likely a war. I'm not sure, because I think nuclear weapons then actually push the threshold of conflict down, perhaps, but you get much more terrorism, much more asymmetric warfare, other forms of conflict than you do. But I think that's one of the biggest risks now, that that the structures that were built, non-proliferation treaty, U.S. extended deterrence, that non-proliferation regime, I think, is now over.
Now, just a quick follow-up there, Shankar. You said that there's a growing understanding that nuclear weapons are not useful war-fighting weapons. How confident are you that Vladimir Putin believes that?
He uses the threat. And I mean, that's exactly, he uses it to deter NATO or US entry into the war in Ukraine. He uses it to deter them from permitting Ukraine to use weapons to hit Russia, etc. But I'm not sure that even he believes that using nuclear weapons in Ukraine would help him achieve his military goals. I mean, it would make Ukraine unoccupiable. It's different. The reason I say this is because in the 70s and 80s, the idea of a limited nuclear war had currency. Today, I don't think there are people who make that case, and certainly not people who I think have very great credibility across the world. I think that's a shift. Just like all these years of no use have actually created a fairly strong taboo in the minds of leaders about the use of nuclear weapons. These are intangibles, and you can't rely on them to prevent catastrophe. But I do think they exist, and they should be acknowledged.
I only ask because Bob Woodward's latest book about the Ukraine war posits that towards the end of 2022, when the Ukrainians were having some success with their counteroffensive against Russian forces, that Russia was getting very, very close to the use of a tactical nuclear weapon, and that it was China that talked Putin off the ledge, if you like. Do you think that account maybe is exaggerated?
I really don't know. Because I don't know enough about it. I think Putin would want you to believe that. And so would the Chinese.
Yeah.
So, I have no evidence. So I shouldn't be commenting on it.
Yeah. Finally, Shankar, before we go, I wanted to ask, other than your book, what do you think our viewers and our listeners should be reading to understand international politics today?
Today? I think it's changing too fast to actually recommend anything except something very basic, of how to think about international politics. And for me, I always find going back to the basics, going back to E.H. Carr, for instance, or to Morgenthau, always very good because it forces you to rethink your assumptions. All the things that we absorb day by day, and we acquire this sort of patina of assumptions over time, without realizing it subconsciously. And so I would go back. I mean, I've enjoyed books like, there are great books on environmental history, The Retreat of the Elephants, Elvin, for instance, on China, which I really enjoyed. But about thinking about the world today, I'd go back to the classics, to the IR classics, and rethink all our assumptions. Because as I said, I do think we're in the middle of a historic shift. What would you suggest, Sam?
Oh boy, you're putting me on the spot, but I do think, I do agree with you that...
I would go back to Hedley Bull and international society, because that's a good way to think about order and where we are.
Well, Hedley Bull, a great Australian scholar, of course, and coined the term international society. And yes, I would very much endorse that suggestion. You also, I think, suggested E.H. Carr, The 20 Years Crisis, which I read as a student, and I'm ashamed to say I haven't gone back to. And Hans Morgenthau's book, Politics Among Nations, which contains, for me, the sage advice: never put your opponent in a position from which they cannot retreat without losing face.
Mao Zedong used to say, give him a way out.
Right.
Because otherwise he'll fight like a tiger with his back to the wall. But he must be able to see a door and see an exit.
Indeed. Shankar, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sam. A real pleasure.
And thank you for joining us for the launch of Shiv Shankar Menon's India in a World Adrift. Once again, the book retails for $12.99 here in Australia. It's available in good bookstores and online. If you're joining us from outside Australia, we recommend purchasing via penguin.com.au. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.